The streets of Mill Creek were quiet that evening, with just the faint hum of passing cars and the occasional chatter from corner diners. Officer Jack Lawson was wrapping up his shift, exhaustion weighing heavily on his shoulders. It had been a long, grueling day filled with reports, disputes, and patrols. Nothing out of the ordinary, but enough to make him look forward to getting home. As he rounded the corner of Maple and 3rd, Jack noticed movement from the corner of his eye. A small, scrappy puppy with wiry brown fur was tailing him at a distance. At first, Jack paid it no mind. Stray dogs were common in this part of town. He figured the pup was probably sniffing around for scraps and would eventually lose interest. But it didn't. The puppy followed him persistently, limping slightly with every step but determined to keep up. Jack frowned and stopped, turning to face the little dog. It froze in place but didn't flee. Its wide, brown eyes met his, a mix of fear and urgency that tugged at something deep inside him. "All right, what's your deal, huh?" Jack muttered, crouching down slowly. The puppy hesitated, then cautiously approached, its ribs visible beneath its thin coat. Jack noticed something unusual. A makeshift collar around its neck, tied with an old shoelace. Tucked beneath it was a crumpled piece of paper. His curiosity piqued. Jack gently removed the note and unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a hurry. "Please help. There are children at 114 Pine Street. They're in danger. Don't call anyone. Just come." Jack's brow furrowed as he reread the note. His first instinct was to think it was some kind of prank. But there was something about the desperate tone that made him pause. Pine Street wasn't far, just a few blocks away. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that something was seriously wrong. He glanced down at the puppy, who whined softly, as if urging him to hurry. "All right, buddy," Jack sighed, standing up. "Let's check it out." The house at 114 Pine Street was an old, two-story structure that had seen better days. The front yard was overgrown with weeds, and the windows were dark and grimy. Jack approached cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the holster at his side. The puppy trotted ahead of him, sniffing at the cracked front steps before stopping near the door. Jack knocked firmly. No response. "Police! Is anyone home?" he called out, listening for any signs of life inside. Silence. He tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. He hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open, his senses on high alert. The interior was dimly lit, the only light coming from a flickering street lamp outside. The air was stale, carrying a faint odor of mildew and neglect. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Jack called again, stepping inside. A faint noise reached his ears, a soft whimper. He froze, straining to listen. Came again, this time clearer. It was the sound of a child. Jack followed the noise, moving cautiously through the cluttered living room and down a narrow hallway. At the end of the hall, he found a small, makeshift bedroom. Inside were two children, a little girl no older than 6, and a baby in a worn-out crib. The girl sat on the floor, hugging her knees to her chest. Her dirty, tear-streaked face turned towards Jack, wide eyes filled with fear. "It's okay," Jack said gently, lowering himself to her level. "I'm Officer Jack. I'm here to help." The girl didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. The baby let out a soft cry, drawing Jack's attention. He stepped closer to the crib and saw that the infant couldn't have been more than a few months old. Both children were pale and undernourished, their clothes tattered and unwashed. "Are you two here alone?" Jack asked softly. The girl nodded hesitantly. "Where's your mom or dad?" She shook her head, biting her lip as fresh tears welled in her eyes. Jack's heart sank. Someone had left these kids here, abandoned them in a place that was barely livable. He couldn't leave them like this. "It's gonna be all right," he assured her. "We'll get you somewhere safe. I promise." Jack pulled out his radio and hesitated. The note had warned against calling anyone, but he knew he couldn't handle this alone. He decided to keep the call discreet, contacting only a close colleague from Child Protective Services. As he waited for help to arrive, Jack gently wrapped the baby in a blanket he found in the room. The puppy had followed him inside and now sat protectively by the girl's side. as if it had been watching over them all along. "What's your name?" Jack asked the girl. "Maggie," she whispered.
Magia.
"You're very brave, you know that?" She didn't answer, but a faint hint of trust flickered in her eyes. Jack knew it would take time to rebuild trust, time to heal. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough to take the first step. As sirens echoed faintly in the distance, Jack found himself silently thanking the little dog who had led him here. It wasn't the ending he had expected for his day, but maybe it was the beginning of something else, something important. Jack stood outside the house on Pine Street, cradling the baby in his arms. The night air was cold and crisp, and Maggie hovered close to his side, clutching the puppy. She still hadn't said much beyond her name, but Jack could tell she was calming down, at least enough to hold on to some hope. His call had been answered quickly. Within minutes, a familiar black SUV pulled up to the curb. Out stepped Ellen Martinez, a social worker with Child Protective Services, CPS, her face etched with concern. Jack had worked with Ellen before on a few child welfare cases, and he trusted her. She was efficient but compassionate, always prioritizing the well-being of the kids under her care. "Jack?" Ellen greeted him, her gaze shifting to the children. "What's the situation?" "Found them here. The baby's maybe 6 months old. The girl's name is Maggie. No sign of any parents or guardians. The place is in terrible condition, hardly any food, no heating, nothing safe for them to stay in. They've clearly been on their own for a while." Ellen knelt to Maggie's level. "Hi there, sweetie. My name's Ellen. We're going to make sure you and your baby brother are safe. Okay?" Maggie didn't answer but took a small step closer to Jack, her fingers tightening around the puppy's collar. "She's scared," Jack said quietly. "Probably doesn't trust strangers right now. They've been through a lot."
Ellen nodded understandingly.
"That's normal. We'll take them to a temporary shelter tonight. I'll start looking into relatives or foster care options first thing in the morning." Jack hesitated. He knew CPS was stretched thin, and even though Ellen would do her best, the system wasn't perfect. Children like Maggie and her brother often bounced between placements, struggling to find stability. Jack couldn't bear the thought of them being tossed around after all they'd endured. "Wait," Jack said abruptly. "Let me take them tonight. I can't leave them at some shelter with strangers. At least not right now." Ellen blinked in surprise. "Jack, are you sure? I mean, it's not exactly in your job description. You've already done a lot just finding them." "I'm sure," he said firmly. "They need someone they can trust right now. I'll take them home and keep them safe for the night. You can figure out the rest tomorrow." After a pause, Ellen sighed and gave a small nod. "All right, but I'll need you to sign a temporary care agreement. And I'll be checking in first thing in the morning." The drive to Jack's house was a quiet one. The baby had fallen asleep in the car seat Ellen provided, and Maggie sat silently in the back, staring out the window. The puppy lay curled up at her feet. Jack glanced at her through the rearview mirror a few times, wondering what was going through her mind. When they finally pulled into his driveway, Jack helped Maggie out of the car and led her inside. His house was modest but warm, a 2-bedroom bungalow with hardwood floors, simple furniture, and a lived-in feel. He hadn't planned on sharing it with anyone, but that was about to change. "Make yourself at home," Jack said softly. "I'll set up a space for you and your brother in the guest room." Maggie nodded but didn't move from the entryway. Jack grabbed a few extra blankets and a small crib he'd stored away in the attic, left over from when his niece had visited a few years ago. He quickly set it up in the guest room and brought the sleeping baby inside. "You can sleep in here too," Jack told Maggie, pointing to the bed. "You'll be safe, I promise." She hesitated, then stepped inside, still holding the puppy. Jack watched as she gently lay down beside the baby's crib, one hand resting on the edge as if she were afraid he might disappear if she let go. "Do you want anything to eat?" Jack asked softly. Maggie shook her head. "Okay. Well, I'll be right down the hall if you need anything." He left the door slightly ajar and retreated to the living room. Sitting on the couch, Jack ran a hand through his hair and exhaled deeply. This was not how he'd expected his evening or his life to go. He was a cop, not a parent. What did he know about taking care of kids, especially ones who had been through trauma like this? The puppy wandered over and rested its head on Jack's knee, its tail wagging slightly. Jack scratched behind its ears absently. "You really changed everything tonight, didn't you?" he muttered. "Guess I owe you for that." He leaned back, trying to process everything. The image of Maggie's frightened eyes wouldn't leave his mind. Whoever had abandoned those kids had left them in unimaginable circumstances. Jack couldn't understand how anyone could do that. All he knew now was that he couldn't walk away. They needed him, at least for the time being. As the night stretched on, Jack found himself pacing the living room, unable to relax. He checked on the kids twice, finding them both asleep each time. Still, sleep didn't come easily for him. His mind kept racing with questions about who the children were, what had happened to their parents, and what the next steps would be. By the time dawn broke, Jack was exhausted but resolute. He had made a promise to Maggie that he wouldn't abandon her, and he intended to keep it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them. He had found himself in an unexpected role, but maybe, just maybe, it was where he was meant to be. Jack woke up to the sound of soft footsteps padding across the hallway. He sat up on the couch, disoriented for a moment, before the events of the previous night came rushing back. He glanced at the clock, 6:30 a.m. The house was eerily quiet except for the faint sounds of movement coming from the guest room. He stood and stretched before heading down the hall. The door to the room was ajar and he peered inside. Maggie was awake, sitting on the floor beside the crib. The baby, now awake too, was kicking his legs and gurgling softly. Maggie was feeding him from a bottle Jack hadn't even realized she had packed in a worn bag he'd brought from the house on Pine Street. She looked up at Jack as he entered but said nothing. "Good morning," Jack said gently. "How's your brother?" Maggie hesitated for a moment, then whispered, "He's okay." It was the first time she had spoken since last night. Jack smiled softly, relieved that she seemed to be opening up, even if just a little. "Do you want some breakfast?" he asked. She nodded shyly. Jack figured she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days, maybe longer. He had no idea what kids liked for breakfast, so he kept it simple: scrambled eggs, toast, and some juice. As the smell of cooking filled the kitchen, he heard tiny footsteps approaching. Maggie peeked around the corner, holding the baby on her hip. Jack was impressed. She handled her brother with a protective instinct far beyond her years. "Here, sit down," Jack said, pulling out a chair for her. Maggie cautiously sat, still holding the baby. Jack placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of her, along with a glass of orange juice. She eyed the food suspiciously at first but eventually took a small bite. It wasn't long before she was eating ravenously, as if she hadn't had a full meal in weeks. "Slow down," Jack said gently. "It's okay. There's plenty more if you want it." Maggie paused, her face flushing with embarrassment. "Sorry," she mumbled. "You don't have to apologize," Jack assured her. "I'm just glad you're eating." The puppy wandered into the kitchen and sniffed at Jack's feet, tail wagging. Jack chuckled and tore off a small piece of toast to give to the dog. "Does he have a name?" Jack asked, gesturing to the puppy. Maggie shook her head.
No.
"He just showed up one day, like he was watching us." "Sounds like he's your guardian angel," Jack said, scratching the dog's ears. "We should come up with a name for him." Maggie thought for a moment before quietly suggesting, "Lucky." Jack smiled. "Lucky it is." A short while later, Ellen Martinez arrived, as promised. Jack let her in, and she immediately went to check on the children. Maggie stiffened when Ellen entered the room, her body language turning guarded once again. "It's okay," Jack reassured her. "Ellen's a friend. She's here to help." Ellen crouched to Maggie's eye level and smiled warmly.
Magia.
"I just want to make sure you and your brother are doing okay. Can I ask you a few questions?" Maggie clutched her brother protectively but gave a small nod. Jack stayed nearby, offering silent support as Ellen gently probed for details about their situation. It was slow going, but eventually, Maggie revealed that her baby brother's name was Caleb. Their mother had been gone for several days, maybe longer. leaving them alone in the house with barely any food or supplies. "Do you know where your mom went?" Ellen asked softly. Maggie shook her head, her eyes welling up with tears. She said she'd be back, but she didn't come." Jack felt his chest tighten at the sight of Maggie's tears. No child should have to bear that kind of abandonment. Ellen's expression softened. "You've been really brave, Maggie. You took care of your brother all by yourself. That's amazing." Maggie wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her shirt, but didn't say anything else. Ellen stood and pulled Jack aside to talk privately. "Jack, this is serious," she said in a low voice. "If what Maggie says is true, their mother could be facing criminal charges for child neglect. We need to find her." "I figured as much," Jack replied. "But what happens to the kids in the meantime?" "We'll have to place them in emergency foster care," Ellen said reluctantly. "I know you offered to take them for the night, but long-term care is a whole different situation. You'd have to go through the proper channels, background checks, home evaluations." Jack's jaw tightened. He understood the rules, but the thought of Maggie and Caleb being sent to strangers tore at him. They trusted him now, and he didn't want to break that trust. "Let me foster them," Jack said firmly. "At least until you can figure out a more permanent solution." Ellen blinked in surprise. "Jack, are you sure? This isn't something to take lightly. It's a huge responsibility." "I know," he said, "but they need stability right now. They've already been through enough. I can give them that." Ellen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, I'll fast-track the process as much as I can, but you'll still need to meet with a caseworker and go through some paperwork. In the meantime, I'll mark you down as their temporary guardian." "Thank you," Jack said sincerely. That evening, after Ellen left, Jack found himself sitting on the living room floor with Maggie and Caleb. The TV was on, playing a children's cartoon, but Maggie seemed more interested in petting Lucky than watching. Caleb was nestled in Jack's arms, cooing softly. "Hey, Maggie," Jack said quietly. "I know this is all new and probably scary, but I just want you to know. You and your brother are safe here. I'm not going anywhere." Maggie glanced at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of dishonesty. Slowly, she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jack knew there would be challenges ahead. Navigating social services, dealing with the trauma these kids had faced, and maybe even confronting their mother if she ever came back. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Over the next few days, Jack adjusted to his new reality. His house, once quiet and predictable, was now filled with the sounds of children and the scurrying paws of Lucky. Caleb's cries in the middle of the night had become routine, as had Maggie's cautious presence in every room. Jack wasn't used to this level of responsibility, but he adapted quickly. He woke up earlier to prepare meals, made sure Caleb had clean clothes and diapers, and gently encouraged Maggie to talk about anything she wanted. At first, she remained reserved. She followed Jack around but didn't say much. Every small kindness, offering her a snack, turning on cartoons she liked, was met with hesitant gratitude. It was clear that Maggie was used to fending for herself. However, small moments began to chip away at her walls. One morning, while Jack was scrambling eggs, Maggie spoke up unexpectedly. "Do you have kids?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack paused, the question catching him off guard. "No, I don't. Just my niece, Emma. She used to visit a lot when she was younger. I help take care of her sometimes." Maggie tilted her head. "Did you want kids?" Jack smiled softly. "I never really thought about it. My job keeps me pretty busy, but I guess life had other plans." He set a plate of eggs and toast in front of her. "Now, I've got you and Caleb keeping me on my toes." Maggie gave a small smile, the first real one Jack had seen since meeting her. It was a fleeting moment, but it gave him hope. Later that day, Ellen stopped by with a caseworker named Marissa, who was assigned to evaluate Jack's home for temporary foster care. Jack was nervous as Marissa walked through the house, taking notes on everything from safety measures to living conditions. He had done his best to child-proof the place, installing locks on cabinets and making sure the crib was set up correctly. Still, he knew there was a lot riding on this visit. Meanwhile, Ellen sat with Maggie in the living room, gently asking her more questions about her life before Jack found her. Jack stayed within earshot, listening without intruding. "Do you remember how long your mom was gone before Officer Jack found you?" Ellen asked softly. Maggie hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "A few days, I think. It was hard to tell. Sometimes she'd leave us for a while, but she always came back before." "Before what?"
Ellen preempted gently.
Maggie hugged her knees to her chest. "Before Caleb ran out of food. I tried to make it last, but he was really hungry." Ellen's expression softened. "You did an amazing job, Maggie. You kept your brother safe, and that's not easy for someone your age. You're really strong." Maggie didn't respond, but Jack saw her eyes glisten with unshed tears. He wanted to wrap her in a protective hug but knew it was important to let her process things at her own pace. After Marissa's evaluation was complete, she and Ellen pulled Jack aside. "Your home checks out," Marissa said with a nod. "It's clean, safe, and you've taken good precautions for the kids. I'll recommend approval for temporary foster care. It'll take some time to finalize everything, but for now you're officially their guardian." Jack exhaled in relief. "Thank you. I appreciate it." Ellen gave him a reassuring smile. "You're doing a good thing, Jack. These kids need someone like you." "Thanks," he replied. "I'm just doing what I can. They deserve a chance at a normal life." Marissa added, "We'll continue to check in regularly. If you need support, therapy services, supplies, anything, let us know. Kids who've experienced abandonment and trauma often need extra care." Jack nodded, understanding the weight of the responsibility he had taken on. "I'll do whatever it takes." That evening, Jack decided to take Maggie and Caleb for a walk around the neighborhood. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the quiet streets. Lucky trotted happily beside them, tail wagging as he sniffed every tree and lamppost they passed. Caleb babbled contentedly in a stroller, while Maggie walked beside Jack, holding onto the stroller handle. As they passed a park, Maggie slowed and looked longingly at the playground. Jack noticed and smiled. "Want to stop and play for a bit?" he asked. Maggie hesitated, glancing around nervously. Is it okay?" "Of course it is. You're allowed to have fun, Maggie," Jack said gently. "Go ahead." She still seemed unsure but eventually nodded. Jack parked the stroller near a bench and watched as Maggie cautiously approached the swings. She sat on one and began to push herself slowly, her legs barely leaving the ground at first. Gradually, she gained more confidence, swinging higher and higher. The sound of her laughter, light and genuine, warmed Jack's heart. He sat back on the bench, smiling as he watched her play. Caleb gurgled happily in his stroller, kicking his feet in rhythm with Maggie's movements. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. Maggie eventually hopped off the swing and ran back to Jack, slightly out of breath but grinning. "That was fun," she said shyly. "Glad to hear it," Jack replied. "You know, there's no rush to grow up too fast. You can be a kid here. You don't have to take care of everything on your own anymore." Maggie's smile faded slightly, her gaze dropping to the ground. "But what if she comes back?" Jack understood immediately. She was talking about their mother. "We'll deal with that if it happens," Jack said firmly. "But right now you're safe. You and Caleb are with me, and I'm not going anywhere." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes full of uncertainty but also a glimmer of hope. "Okay," she whispered. Jack knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still many unanswered questions, and the shadows of Maggie's past would take time to fade. But for now, they were making progress, one small step at a time. Together, they were beginning to build something that resembled a family. The following week brought a mix of new challenges and small victories. Jack learned to navigate the delicate balance of providing structure without overwhelming Maggie. He set up a routine: breakfast together, outdoor playtime, and quiet evenings where they'd watch cartoons or read. Caleb continued to thrive under the care and attention he was now receiving. His appetite improved, and he began to smile and coo more often. Maggie still had her moments of anxiety, but each day, she seemed to grow more comfortable in her new environment. One morning, Jack received an unexpected phone call from Ellen. He stepped onto the porch to take the call, keeping an eye on Maggie, who was inside drawing at the kitchen table. "Jack, we found their mother," Ellen said without preamble. Jack's stomach dropped. "Where?" "She turned herself in at a local shelter last night. She's asking to see the kids," Ellen explained. "She says she wants to make things right." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What's her story? Why did she leave them like that?" "She claims she was in a bad situation," Ellen said. "Domestic violence, financial troubles, addiction, it's a lot. She says she didn't want to hurt them, but she wasn't in a place to take care of them. I'm not saying that excuses what happened, but it's complicated." Jack's jaw clenched. He hated the thought of putting Maggie and Caleb through more trauma, especially after they just started to heal. "What happens now?" "There will be an investigation," Ellen replied. "She'll need to go through parenting evaluations, therapy, and drug testing. Nothing is guaranteed. But if she cooperates and shows she's serious about turning her life around, she could eventually petition for custody." Jack's gut twisted at the thought. He didn't want to rip Maggie and Caleb away from everything they were building together. But he also knew he had to consider what was best for them in the long run. "Has she asked to see them?" Jack asked after a pause. "Yes, but I wanted to check with you first. This needs to be handled carefully. If you think Maggie isn't ready, we can postpone it." Jack glanced through the window at Maggie. She was focused on her drawing, her face calm for once. He didn't want to shatter that peace, but he also knew they couldn't avoid the topic forever. "I'll talk to her," Jack finally said. "But I want to be there if they meet." "Of course," Ellen agreed. "I'll coordinate with you and set it up in a neutral environment." That evening, Jack sat down with Maggie on the couch. Caleb was asleep in his crib, and Lucky lay curled up at their feet. Jack gently cleared his throat, unsure how to begin. "Maggie, there's something I need to tell you," he said softly. Maggie looked up at him, her expression wary. "I heard from Ellen today," Jack continued. "Your mom. She's back. She wants to see you and Caleb." Maggie froze, her eyes widening. She wants to see us?" "Yeah. She said she's trying to get better and wants to make things right," Jack explained. "But nothing is going to happen right away. You don't have to see her unless you want to. It's your choice." For a long moment, Maggie was silent. Her small hands clenched into fists in her lap. "She left us," she whispered. "She said she'd come back, but she didn't. Caleb was crying so much, and I didn't know what to do." Jack placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You had to be so strong for him, and you did an amazing job. You didn't deserve to go through that. But I'm here now, and I'm not going to let anything bad happen to you or your brother." Tears filled Maggie's eyes. I don't know if I want to see her," she admitted. "What if she leaves again?" "That's a valid fear," Jack said gently. "You don't have to decide right now. You can take your time. And if you ever do want to see her, I'll be there with you. You won't have to go through it alone." Maggie wiped her tears away and leaned into Jack's side. For the first time, she let herself cry openly, releasing all the fear and hurt she'd been carrying. Jack wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she sobbed. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. "You've got people who care about you now. We'll figure this out together." In the days that followed, Maggie struggled with the decision. Jack didn't push her, giving her space to process her emotions. He noticed that she became more withdrawn, often retreating to her room for hours at a time. It was clear that the news had stirred up memories and fears she wasn't ready to confront. One afternoon, while Jack was folding laundry, Maggie approached him hesitantly. I think I want to see her," she said quietly. Jack stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "Are you sure?" Maggie nodded, though her expression was conflicted. I need to know why she left us." Jack knelt to her level and placed a hand on her shoulder. "I'll be with you the whole time. If it gets too hard, we can leave. You're in control of this, Maggie." "Okay," she whispered, her eyes shining with determination and fear. The meeting was arranged for the following weekend at a child-friendly counseling center. Jack, Maggie, and Caleb arrived early, with Ellen there to support them. Maggie clung to Jack's hand as they walked inside. Her grip tightened when she saw her mother waiting in one of the rooms. The woman was thin and tired-looking, but her eyes lit up when she saw her children. "Maggie, Caleb?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Maggie froze for a moment, then slowly stepped forward, her expression guarded. Jack stayed close, ready to intervene if needed. "Why did you leave us?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling. Their mother choked back a sob. I was scared. I was in a bad place. I thought if I left, I could get help and come back for you. But I made a terrible mistake. I never wanted to hurt you." Maggie's face crumpled, and for a moment, Jack thought she might run away. But instead, she whispered, "You really hurt us." "I know," her mother replied, her voice breaking. "And I'm so sorry. I want to make it right. I want to be better for you and Caleb." Jack watched as Maggie stood there, wrestling with her emotions. Slowly, she turned and looked at Jack, who gave her an encouraging nod. This was her journey, and whatever decision she made, he would support her. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Maggie finally said, "but maybe I can try." It wasn't a full resolution, but it was a beginning. For the first time, Maggie took a step toward healing. Not just for herself, but for her brother and the future they all deserved.